Hi, welcome to Talk Class, the OECD's education podcast. I'm Clara Young and I work in the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills. In this episode, I'm talking to Sanjay Sarma. Sanjay is the Vice President for Open Learning at MIT, and he's overseen many of MIT's online learning systems, including MITx and OpenCourseWare. He and Luc Yoquinto are also the co-authors of a book that came out last summer called Grasp: The Science of Transforming How We Learn. Sanjay is also a professor of mechanical engineering at MIT, so he's a practicing teacher. Hi, Sanjay. Thanks for coming on this podcast.
It's lovely to see you, Clara. A pleasure.
The OECD just carried out a third survey in early March on how education systems are dealing with the pandemic. Not surprisingly, to the question about which forms of distance learning schools have been using in 24 countries, the overwhelming favorite was online platforms. But what we're hearing back from teachers and students and from you is that the virtual classroom is the worst of both worlds. So what's going wrong?
Yeah, Clara, the reason that I say that and others say it is because people confuse this virtual remote learning with online learning. It's not. Good online learning is pre-recorded videos, which are very carefully crafted, and they're asynchronous. So a student can pause it, rewind. And the problem with our regular classroom is, in fact, I'm not a huge fan of lectures to begin with, because, a student sitting in the back of a 100% classroom is socially distanced to begin with, but at least there's a little smidgen of a human connection. And what a Zoom lecture or a video conference lecture does, it has neither the benefits of asynchronous online video nor that little smidgen of human connection from being in person. So it's the worst of both worlds. And sure enough, it's we can see it. We just all this changes. We can now see what's going on.
Right, so. Right. In about half of your book is devoted to cognitive science and everything that we've been learning about the brain so far, and how we can take those concepts and to make learning and teaching better. What would you say would be the handful of key concepts that we should be putting to use in education? And perhaps especially in this context of digital education right now.
Even before I describe the handful, let me share a quick insight. It's sort of something I discovered from looking at all the science. I expected something cold and clinical, but what I discovered was a pattern that was both warm and intuitive. Essentially, we are evolved to learn. That's what childhood is. We're evolved to teach. That's what parenting is. So the more one can, and even with adult education, the more we can reflect on how we as parents teach, which includes, for example, not giving long lectures, right? My daughter says, "Daddy, don't lecture me," used to say. I say, "Darling, that's what I do for a living," right? Don't give long lectures, right? Give 10-minute chunks, number one. Number two, at the end of 10 minutes, have a discussion, probe the student's understanding. That's actually called the testing effect. Not high-stakes tests, but just a discussion, right? The third thing is space out the learning. Don't try and cram an hour's worth of lecture into one sprint. Do 10 minutes, then do another 10 minutes of a different topic, and then come back and remind the student a day later, a week later, a month later about the thing they learned. So that's called spaced retrieval. Interleave. What that means is mix things up a little bit, because the brain likes contrasts. So if you're teaching a student how to calculate the surface area of a sphere versus a cone, don't do sphere, 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 cone, cone, cone. Do sphere, cone, sphere, cone, sphere, cone, because it's the act of loading the understanding. That's when the learning occurs. It's not once you loaded it, you're just doing the same thing repetitively, right? By the way, these lessons apply just as much to sports. And I wish we brought the same level of science to learning and education that athletes get on the basketball court or football or the football arena. So those are just some, but I could go on and on. Here's another very interesting thing. Turns out, obviously when you're hungry, the body generates saliva, right? The equivalent to the brain for hunger is curiosity, and the equivalent of saliva is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Make people curious. That's half the battle. Everything else follows. All of these, I wish we would do.
In your book, you discuss all this, and then all kinds of interesting learning techniques and little experimental schools and certain programs at MIT. But I would say that at the end of the day, when we finish reading it, your concern is always, how do we scale up this kind of program? How do we make it possible for as many people as possible to learn this way? So many of the concepts that you're talking about are actually quite easy and inexpensive to implement into traditional schools.
That's absolutely right. Look, parenting by definition is harder to scale. I have a friend who has triplets. It's difficult, right? But what we do in educational system design is figure out a way to scale things. The problem is when you ignore the lessons and do what's convenient, that's where you end up painting yourself into a corner, which is where we are right now. The way to implement this in schools, first of all, is don't waste time lecturing, because a lot of these tricks are easier to apply with online education, right? And I'm talking about things like Khan Academy, Three Blue, One Brown on YouTube. There's a treasure trove of beautiful content on YouTube. And then if you take what we do with these massive open online courses with assessments and so on, then you can apply some of these tricks much more easily online. Replace the lecture with then coaching, curiosity, field trips, hands on. And that's essentially a multi dimensional description of what Sal Khan and others refer to as a flipped classroom. I'm just giving you a much more nuanced version of it.
Right.
And yes, it is possible to apply these tricks at scale. It is possible. We just have to have the wherewithal, the discipline, and the resolve to do it and to change the systems to enable it.
Well, I mean, this is probably the time to do it with the pandemic sort of cracking everything open. This is an opportunity to quite massively change the way we teach and learn and use these flipped classroom techniques as you talk about.
Oh, without a doubt. Look, I mean, how tragic will it be if we go back to classrooms that look like Zoom lectures, and we look at each other and go, this is what we were yearning for, when nature confiscated our ability to be together. Now that we've gotten it back through vaccines and all this strife we've been through, we just recreated what we had before. What a tragedy that would be.
Well, I wonder if some of the reservations we will have, that education systems will have towards making reforms, is some of the feedback that we've been getting about online learning. I mean, when you and Luke Yoquinto wrote the book, it was before the pandemic. But even so, you were already worried about that online learning, if it wasn't used properly, if there wasn't, as you said, a human being in the mix who students could turn to. And in many cases during this pandemic, that has been the case for a lot of more unfortunate students, that it was going to turn students off school. And, now that the world's gone through this crash course of remote learning, it could be possible, the worst case scenario, that the final conclusion will be, nah, online learning, it just doesn't work. Do you have that fear?
Yeah, I absolutely have that fear. This is not the first time, right? When you deploy technology and you do it wrong, you end up creating a barrier, to the technology. And I think this is what we feared all the while, that people confused remote learning with online learning. What you have right now is remote learning, right? That's why it's the worst of both worlds. You put your finger on it. I am very worried that people will confuse this with the nirvana that we should be achieving. This ain't the nirvana. This was a jury-rigged heroic action in the face of a pandemic, but this is not what we would have done if we had the time.
So how should we proceed now that we're, at least in some countries, we're going back to school, going back to the classroom? There is an opportunity for making some quite significant changes. What's the priority? How should we proceed? What should we begin with?
Well, let me say that, first of all, let us all sign a compact that one-way conversations are what we want to eliminate. If you start with that, everything else follows, actually. If the professor is standing there speaking for 70% of the time, 80% of the time, or 90% of the time, something's wrong, right? Okay, so how do you prevent that? Well, now, without a pandemic, hopefully in some countries it's going to be a long time. I know it's not even close, but in some countries it's the end is closer. Start recording videos. Look at the facilities available on YouTube and other channels. It's amazing stuff. Stunning. I mean, I would struggle to give a lecture like that, and distill the concepts down so beautifully. You look at that and start creating lesson plans that incorporate it and incorporate students actually acting, discussing, doing, rather than just passively listening and tuning out. I think that should be the starting point. All I'm saying is that there's lots of videos out there already on YouTube,
Right.
right? Let's say you wanted to teach, I don't know, multiplication or something. There's beautiful content, but multiplication is very basic. Let's say even a historical concept, right? World War II, right? There are a lot of videos that show, the expansion of the empire, and the battles and so on. It's actually they're very good videos and a great way to learn. So try and figure out, what I'm saying to teachers is, figure out how to flip your classroom so that your lesson plan is one in which students watch those videos, and in the classroom, students and you are doing something,
Right.
playing out something. What would happen if the Battle of Midway had not occurred? What would happen if the Battle of the Bulge hadn't occurred? What was Rommel's role in Africa? Whatever it is, any topic, parse it and have them play it out. That is learning.
Right.
Listening ain't learning.
Now, I'm sort of thinking that, okay, now that in the US, the schools are finally opening, and, schools have been opening and closing in countries back and forth since the pandemic started, we're now really talking about steep learning losses and trying to grapple with that. Now, many people are looking to personalize online learning to help target exactly what the gaps are. Do you think this is a silver bullet for catching up post-pandemic?
It's a silver bullet if it's done right. If we pile on more of the bad stuff, it won't. It might do more damage. I don't know. I mean, I think that the catch up, we have to embrace the future rather than sort of drag the past into this new technology. We have to sort of rethink the way we do it. And my worry is that of course, everyone's busy and everyone's catching up and everyone's got their own personal struggles. And I don't mean to dismiss that. But where the leaders of schools need to come in is enable systems where these heroic teachers can actually get ahead of this a little bit. Because if they're playing catch up, the bad stuff is what we'll end up doing, which is Zoom lectures.
Exactly. Let's delve a little bit more into machine learning enabled education software. It's personalized, so it adapts to each learner, and it can be very cost effective, which is something education ministries must have on their, really thinking about. But you have some strong reservations about it. What are they?
Absolutely. Look, I work in AI, and MIT is sort of at the center of AI, and I think it's a bit of a people naturally, I guess, and the press doesn't help, tends to hype up what AI is. If I talk to a young student, and a brilliant young student, and the student doesn't understand friction, I have to almost psychoanalyze where they've misunderstood it. The question they might ask me is something like, if friction points backwards, how does a motorcycle move forwards when the wheel spins? And I have to explain to them, no, you have it backwards, actually. In the case of a motorcycle, actually, it's a friction that's pushing the motorcycle forward. And you got to sort of do that. There is no AI system that can do that. Do not kid yourself. There are AI systems that will do things like automatic grading. Like if a student writes a formula, we can grade it. That's cool. And that's what we do with massive open online courses. But somehow, to conflate that spectrum of intelligence and the things that a teacher can do and a student can benefit from into AI, that's the mistake I'm concerned about. AI will not solve the problem. Flip the classroom, empower the teachers will solve the problem. AI can take some stuff off the plate for the teacher. Like, a student wants to know, when is the exam due? Well, a chatbot can answer that. Focus on that right now. But do not assume somehow AI can replace the teacher, because we're not even close.
Okay. And then there's also the surveillance techniques that we need to be careful about that monitor students' progress, like eye sensors that monitor eye blink rate and things like that. What's the most important thing that we need to watch out for in this regard?
Well, look, it's very simple. One of the things that we've already made this mistake before in our book, Luke and I talk about the battle between Dewey, who was really the hero, and Thorndike. Essentially, he thought he understood neuroscience, but really he did not. I mean, it was early days. He was a brilliant researcher, but he sort of declared victory. And then the behaviorists, Thorndike, and then Pavlov, and then Skinner, they tried to treat students like pigeons. You give them reward, they'll do this, and if you don't give them a reward, they'll do this. And in fact, our school systems, you could argue, are based on the victory of the Thorndike philosophy or the Dewey philosophy. What we do know is there's an unbelievable amount about learning about the brain we do not understand. And there's actually almost magical, almost mysterious, properties, emergent properties, because 86 billion neurons doing all sorts of things. So it is arrogant to feel that somehow we can monitor eye movement or something and make it better, because the negative consequences are far worse and far sort of less understood. So we're not even ready for that. Don't do variables, don't do brain interfaces, just fix the system right now.
The Thorndike school of thought, which of course triumphed in the end and is why schools are the way they are now in general, is one of the reasons why we have such what you call winnowing in education, or such a strong sorting system where students who don't perform as well in that kind of system are kind of discouraged from pursuing more studies. And
Yeah, this thought of winnowing, this desire to winnow. First of all, it's a conflict of interest, right? Because the teacher has to transform and winnow, as give grades. I think that's a conflict. And what happens is pretty soon you start leaning on the winnowing side and less on the transforming side. Which parent would do that, right? Again, if you go to the parental analogy, parents don't winnow, right? They're transforming every one of their children to become as successful as they can be, given their interests. So that's point number one. Point number two: if winnowing had driven, Europe in the last 3 centuries, we wouldn't have had Michelangelo. We wouldn't have had Van Gogh. Van Gogh would have been winnowed out a long time ago. Steve Jobs would have been winnowed out. So I mean, again, it's based on this hubris and this arrogance that somehow we have these metrics with which we can determine excellence. Now, using an American analogy, we don't select quarterbacks based on how high they can jump. We judge quarterbacks or tennis players based on how well they recover from an injury and their grit and their courage and their creativity and their ability to play. If it's a tennis player, there's a rain delay and they've got to play 2 5-set matches back to back and they pull it off. That's what we're looking for. How do you win? How do you come up with the metrics for winnowing? And that's again part of the hubris that we're caught in.
Actually like you to talk a little bit about the MicroMasters program. I mean, talking about the sorting, because you've figured out a system that casts a very wide net and gets a lot of people into the program, and some of whom end up doing the second part of the course, the master's at MIT in the labs. It seems to be one answer anyway to the winnowing problem and being more inclusive.
Yeah. So what we did with the MicroMasters, we said, look, why do we winnow? Partly, one of the reasons we winnow is because there's not enough room in a physical classroom. That's one of the reasons selection starts, and then it just goes downhill from there, right? Then we select, assuming that you know how to select. So what we did with the MicroMasters, we said in an online class, the capacity is infinite, really. I mean, the marginal cost of an additional student is very, very small. So we said, no admissions. Anyone take it. Anyone. And just in our 4 or 5 MicroMasters at MIT, we have almost 1 million people enrolled, right? And then they do it at their own pace. It's like playing golf. In golf, you're not playing an opponent. You're playing the course, right? You're playing nature. And you do as well as you can. And if you finish, you have your MicroMasters, right? And by the way, if you have your MicroMasters, then you can use your MicroMasters to apply to school, which is a little bit of winnowing, but now it's based on your own achievement. And it's not based on some random metrics we made up. Now, of course, even the MicroMasters is an online course, right? So could we judge how good a quarterback is with the MicroMasters? Probably not. But it's a much deeper understanding of the student's capability, and they get an achievement. It's a MicroMasters.
Talking about credentials, because we're very much working on that. If we are to encourage lifelong learning, we need to figure out a system of credentials where people can do all different kinds of training, like something in an institutional, a recognized program like MicroMasters, or on-the-job training, and be able to have credentials that link them into a recognized, let's say, institutional system. You said something in your book about a modular distributed student transcript where people could mix and match traditional, non-traditional learning credentials. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, our system is very monolithic right now, right? And it's also, frankly, it's in a university's interest. If a student gets, 200 credits, they finish. If they get 199, they've dropped out. And that's sort of, what is that? So is 199 0 and 200 credits 100%? That's basically how we treat it. And it's, I think that it's almost hegemonistic sometimes of the way universities can reel the transcript. So what we want to do is unbundle the transcript and make it rather a provable record of the student's achievements. And to do that, you have to go to a more granular credential system as well. The MicroMasters is an example. We have many students with multiple MicroMasters. And the thing about these credentials is that I think it's the future, because it's not just for young people, but working adults like you and I, right? You and me, right? I mean, I right now would love to get a micro credential in machine learning. Well, actually, I know machine learning, but some other field, right? I'd like to get a micro credential. As a professor, I don't need it, but let's say I'm working in a job. I would love to, stay on the treadmill, go to the gym, the education gym every week. Our contract is basically go to the gym for 4 years and you're ready for life. I mean, we don't do that with exercise. So we've got to change it. And so we have actually, since we wrote the book, enhanced this further, and we call it Agile Continuous Education, ACE. So it's a treadmill that consists of 3 steps: online credential, an in-person boot camp, because some things need in-person activity, and an internship. And the idea there is, let's say you want to learn machine learning, learn it online. Even machine learning is a team sport. Go work with people, go through a hackathon, implement something, see how they think about it, do an internship at the company, right? And now you have expertise. And then, you want to advance machine learning, go through that cycle again. So we call it ACE, the Agile Continuous Education.
You also talked about a course at Florida International University Law School, which is a course on learning how to learn. And that course was so successful that it helped a lot more students pass the bar exam. And FIU became a top-rated law school. That's something that we could teach already in elementary school or kindergarten, many of the concepts, no?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, there's so many tricks. Again, if we brought the same level of results orientedness and surprisingly humanity, they'd go hand in hand. We can be more human and more results oriented. If we brought that to learning as we did to sports, interval training, right? In sports, it's transformed most sports. What I'm describing is sort of like interval training for learning. And that's basically what the university did. And they improved their outcomes, extraordinary improvement. Why don't we bring that to school? I think we can. And that's basically what we describe in the book, but that's also what you can do with combining online with in person.
I mean, in PISA 2018, one of the questions that we had was on growth mindset. And one of the findings was that students who disagreed with the statement that one's intelligence is something that one can't change very much scored 32 points higher in the reading test than students who agreed with that statement.
Without a doubt. I mean, it's called the growth mindset. Carol Dweck, celebrated psychologist at Stanford. I mean, that's just one of all these lessons we should be learning. I mean, we're practicing, in my view, teachers who are instinctive actually do a great job, but often I think the system imposes dogmas on them which are not necessarily based in science.
Okay, so I think that's pretty well all the time we have. Thanks for speaking to me, Sanjay.
Thank you. Such a pleasure.
I'm Clara Young. To find out more about what we've been talking about, read Sanjay Sarma and Lucio Quinto's book, Grasp, The Science Transforming How We Learn. And to keep up with OECD work on education, have a look at our Twitter page @OECD EDU Skills.